Welcome everybody to the Recording Romani Voices, Documenting Romani Lives workshop, which is remarkable that it's also an in-person workshop. And welcome to everybody who made it to Vienna and is here in person, and welcome to everybody who is on Zoom watching us from wherever you are. My name is Michael Miller. I'm the chair of the National Studies program here at Central European University, and one of the many organizers of this workshop. I am joined here also by Stephen Naran from the Fortunoff Video Archive at Yale University, and by Angela Kotze, who's the chair of the Romani Studies program here at Central European University. Our offices are right next door to each other, so and this is a conference that really came about somewhat fortuitously, in large part because Stephen arrived in Vienna about a year ago as a guest of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, which is also one of the organizers of this workshop. And one of his missions was to make this Holocaust testimony archive available in the region. And there were a number of testimonies of Roma survivors, especially from Slovakia. And these were video testimonies that had not really been made publicly available for various reasons. So the real catalyst for this was thinking about what to do with these testimonies, how to make them publicly available. And we brought together a group of people, including Angela, including Martin Rovid, including Maria Bogdan, and Eva Kovac from the Wiesenthal Institute, and Ari Joskovic, who's a fellow at the Wiesenthal Institute. And we started brainstorming about what we could do. And we thought that one of the things we would do is really look at the whole question of Romani testimonies, not just focused on the Holocaust period and the genocide period, but also focusing on the larger project of recording Romani voices, documenting Romani lives. And this is, of course, a project which has very much been connected to recording Jewish voices and recording Jewish survivors, which is the main collection at the Fortunoff archive. And we thought it'd be interesting really to focus primarily on this question of testimonies, agency, giving voices to the victims, giving voices to the actors, something that we felt like there wasn't enough work on, and in large part because many of the questions that we're going to be raising at this workshop are questions that in the last 60, 70 years have been raised primarily about other groups. And we really wanted to focus on various aspects of the Romani experience in the second half of the 20th century, and also, of course, the early 21st century, but with a real focus on the period of the Second World War and the Romani genocide. So we came together and we put together this workshop over a long, long period of time. And I'm going to give Stephen an opportunity to say a few words, and then I'm going to ask Angela to make the final introduction.
Okay, so I'll be very brief. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Pilar. National Studies program. It's very exciting for the Fortunoff Video Archive to be working with CEU and the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute in this sort of tripartite organization of a conference like this. I hope it's just the beginning of this type of partnership, and we'll do more events like this. I need to say, first off, thank you to Eva Kovac for bringing the Fortunoff Video Archive to Vienna and for helping to organize this conference intellectually as well. And she can't be here today, but she will be here tomorrow. And to Ari Joskovic, who was a senior fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, who also provided a great deal of intellectual support for getting this workshop off the ground. Ari hails from Vanderbilt, and to join us during the conference as well. Just a few things about the Fortunoff Video Archive. This is, as far as I know, the first event we have ever held to focus solely on Roma and Sinti testimonies. And I've been working with the collection on and off since 2003. So I think this is a very important event for us in that it marks a shift in our understanding of how important it is to lift these sources up and to find ways to encourage use of these sources. So we have dozens of testimonies of Roma and Sinti survivors, and very few of them have been used by scholars. And so this is what this workshop is intended to be the beginning of. I will note that it's also the beginning of a number of other initiatives that we'd like to do to encourage research in this area. Another example would be that Eva Kovac and I have been discussing the possibility of a fellowship at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute that would focus exclusively on testimonies from the Fortunoff archive of Sinti and Roma. And we're also interested in perhaps doing a conference or workshop similar to this one at Yale next year. So it's just the beginning of this relationship between FVAHT, CEU, Fortunoff, and of this new important focus on an underexplored aspect of our collection and an important historical topic.
Yes, thank you very much. So my name is Angela Kutzi. I'm the chair of the Romani Studies program, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the whole program. And we are particularly happy to have this workshop together with Fortunoff Video Archive, Wiesenthal Institute, with the Nationalism Studies program, and actually we aim to do a workshop, so it's not a conference. We really would like to generate some honest discussions and critical discussions, and hear those scholars' voice as well, which have not been heard at various international conferences. And as Stephen already pointed out, that the issue of Romani voices, Romani lives, the Romani Holocaust, it's absolutely underdocumented, underappreciated, under-theorized in mainstream academia, and we hope that with this event we can start a new beginning. And before I'm going to close, I just would like to say that we really appreciate actually the contribution by the Cheya Stoica International Foundation Fund, and they provided the image, what you saw on the leaflet as well. And I think that's a very, very important and a very symbolic picture which represents the Romani voices and Romani memories of the Holocaust. So I'm really happy that we have this event, and I wish you a very productive, honest discussion for today. Thank you. So the first panel. Yeah, you should. Please. Okay, so let's start with the first panel, and you'll have three speakers. The first one is Danijel Vojak from the Institute of Social Science, Pilar, Zagreb, and the title of his presentation is going to be Neglected Memories of Margins, Testimonies of Roma Suffering in Croatia during the Second World War. I would like to let you know that we have a really long, actually, leaflet workshop description with abstracts and bios, so I'm not going to spend time to read out that. So you are more than welcome to look at it and just read it by yourself. So shall we start with you?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and you can also use this sort.
Okay, thank you. Okay, after the technical instructions, I will begin with my presentation. Good morning, my name is Danijel. I come from Institute of Social Science in Zagreb, and I will thank the organization for the opportunity to present today's presentation and I hope fruitful debate afterward. Neglected Memories of Marginals, Testimony of the Roma Suffering in Croatia during the Second World War. During the Second World War, I will try to focus on the archival funds where you can find the testimony of the Roma. First one is the State Commission for Establishing the Crimes of the Occupators and their helpers in the People's Republic of Croatia. Milo and Pilar will talk tomorrow, today or tomorrow. He will talk about more in Serbian and Yugoslav context. I will now focus on Croatian context of this fund. During the Second World War in the territory of the independent states of Croatia, anti-fascist units, partisans led by Josip Broz Tito, sought to establish a functional state policy and administrative system in the so-called liberated areas. In this context, have been established anti-fascist council for the national liberation of Yugoslavia, and in the Croatian level, the same anti-fascist council. With this representative body of the Croatian anti-fascists on May 18, 1944, have been established a special institution called the State Commission for Determining the Crimes of the Occupiers and their Helpers. The main task of this commission was to collect data and evidence to establish the responsibility and the existence of particular crime and the responsibility of perpetrators and their accomplices. In its work, the Commission collected data on the victim exclusively as a part of the evidence of the responsibility for the crimes committed. Local authorities were empowered to conduct investigation under the supervision of the Commission. It must be stressed, under the supervision of the Commission, and on the basis of the evidence gathered, the Commission issued its decision, which was a proposal, not order, but proposal to the judicial authorities to institute, to start with legal proceedings before the courts. The Commission registered about 66,000 war criminals. Most of them were domestic criminals, about 49,000, and 50,000 of them were foreign criminals, so-called criminals. The Commission ceased its work in April 1948, which is linked to similar practice of abolishing such organization with the recommendation of the United Nations and the need, I quote, to suppress and forget crimes committed during the war, but to overcome national division. What is important for this commission is that the commission has investigated crimes committed against the Roma population during the Second World War, examining the Roma, especially Roma and non-Roma witnesses. Based on this decision, Commission, the judicial bodies of social Croatia initiated court proceedings. You will see in the Croatian State Archives we have a commission fund. It consists about 57 books, and it's quite large, 751 boxes. My research is now about 60% of this fund. I was about 400 boxes in the last 5 years have been research. And this commission also published a book, it's very important, this book about crimes in Jasenovac camp. In this book is also stated some of the testimony not by Roma, but non-Roma on Roma suffering during the Second World War. Also, very important fund where you can find the Roma testimony is Public Prosecutor Office of Socialistic Republic of Croatia, and I will try to focus on one, I would say, trial against Andrija Tukovic, in which they have collected a lot of testimony about Roma suffering. Croatian anti-fascist judicial bodies have already conducted judicial proceedings against individuals indicted for war and other times during the Second World War. One of the war crimes criminals suspect was Andrija Tukovic, who was a prominent Ustaša official during the Second War. He was Minister of Interior, and later he was Minister of Justice and Worship. What is important, he was the main figure for persecution of the Roma in the Pen States of Croatia. He is one of the author of the racial laws that has passed Ustaša authorities just 2 weeks after they succeeded the power in Croatia with the great support of the Nazi and fascist Italy. After the war, Andrija Tukovic fled first to Austria, then fled to Ireland, and from Ireland in 1948 he emigrated to California. And what happened that the Yugoslav authorities, a special state commission for the crimes of the occupators and their helpers, in July, just 2 months after the war was ended, declared him as a war criminal. The National Commission also had determined a list of 21 crimes in which he is charged, and one of these crimes was the crimes against, refers to the killing of about 40,000 Roma in Jasenovac. 40,000 was the official number that Yugoslav judicial authorities has blamed Andrija Tukovic. The Yugoslav authorities indicted him, but in August 1941, the Yugoslav sent a request to the United States authorities for his extradition, which has the process of 8 years, and at the end, in 1959, United States authorities rejected this request. And then, again, in Yugoslav authorities renewed this request for this extradition in late 1970s. Finally, United States allowed the extradition. He was deported to Zagreb in 1986, has 2 months trial. After trial, he was sentenced to the death. Also, in this trial, we have the video testimony of some Roma, especially Stjepan Nikolic, who was one of the Jasenovac detainees, and he successfully escaped the Jasenovac camp. He witnessed against Andrija Tukovic during this trial and stated a lot of, I would say, a lot of crimes that he and the Ustaše committed in Jasenovac camp against the Roma. Andrija Tukovic died in the prison hospital in 1988. Here's the picture of Andrija Tukovic with the Pavelic, and here's the picture of Andrija Tukovic during the trial. What is important to know in the Roma testimony case was the following. For the purpose of indicting Tukovic, Croatian judicial bodies such as Public Prosecutor Office of Socialistic Republic of Croatia collected testimony from Roma and non-Roma about their suffering during the war. At the beginning of January 1952, Jakša Petric, who was the then chief of the 3rd Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Yugoslavia, sent a letter to Public Prosecutor Office to Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in Belgrade, informing them about the need to speed up extradition proceedings against Andrija Tukovic at the District Court of Southern California in Los Angeles. In this context, Petric stated that the Yugoslav embassy in Washington is cooperating with the lawyer Walker, who asked the judicial authorities in Yugoslavia through the embassy in Washington to collect, I quote, a further direct and convincing witness statement. It was emphasized that there is a special need to gather evidence related to the persecution of the Roma, because they did not have, I quote, any direct evidence that Gypsy were killed in Jasenovac camp. And it is inconvenient, I quote, for the document, for the procedure itself, when the most witness stated that only the Roma from Jasenovac camp, they never returned. Walker sought to prevent the interpretation that the Roma in Jasenovac camp died in their camp by the natural causes. He wanted to find more evidence that they were killed and tortured in this camp. This report ended with a request to gather further evidence, and about 14 months later, I found the next document from the Dragos despot, from Assistant Public Prosecutor in Croatia, who sent a letter to Yugoslav Public Prosecutor Office in the case of this extradition of Andrija Turkovic, informing them that they had gathered the statement and testimony of 5 Roma witnesses who had testified about Jasenovac, what happened to Jasenovac camp. Despot then stated that there is possibility of collecting further testimony of Roma witnesses as eyewitnesses to mass liquidation of Gypsy. End of quote. Also, I found a transcript of telephone dispatch in this file, the Documents in Croatian Archive, sent to the Public Prosecutor Office in 1952, which cites the testimonies of the Roma as Artukovic witness. In this document, they mention the suffering of the Roma inhabitants in Tenje. Tenje is a small place in the eastern part of Croatia, which was the mostly camp for Jewish prisoners. And now these documents under open the question if the also Roma were detainees in this camp. This is also need to be further research. You will see that in Croatian State Archives, I have researched mostly of the fund of the Public Prosecutor Office. It consists of 6 maps, 175 boxes, and 200 books. I have collected about 190 testimony about Roma and non-Roma, about Roma suffering, and about 18 of them were the Roma testimony. This is currently, I needed to finish this research. Is quite long research. To say something about the individual collection of the Roma testimony. First is Verena, who worked as a history teacher in the primary school in Međimurje. Međimurje is the region that was during the Second World War occupied by the Hungarians, and today is most populated with the Roma. I would say Roma-Vlach population. And he collected testimony through his pupils. And at the end, he published several papers on it, and altogether he said that he had collected 10 testimony of Roma from places Drašković, Čakovec, Trnovec, Potorin, Sitnica, and Pribislavec in the form of audio or video recordings, stating that the testimony are available for researchers. This is debatable. Unfortunately, this is debatable. He never published openly all these sources. In 2008, Paul Polinsky published a 3-volume book, One Blood, One Flame, the oral history of Yugoslav gypsies before, during, and after Second World War. During this project, and he published a testimony about 154 Roma survivors from the Yugoslav region, most of them from Serbia, and 4 of them in these books were testimony of the Roma from Croatia. And my personal, I would say, work on the collecting the Roma testimony, I'm now finishing educational documentary for students in Germany. with one Roma NGO, and I researched the history of the suffering of Roma family, Roma Nikolic, from small village Budrovci. It is in Slavonija, in eastern part of Croatia, the Đakovo district during the Second War. At the beginning of June 1942, Utrecht reported 13 members of this family to Jasenovac camp, but the father and the son, Janko and Tihomir, escaped. But several months later, they were caught and sent to the Jasenovac camp. Janko again successfully managed to escape father, and he joined the partisans. But the Tihomir, this is very important to know, Tihomir stayed in and managed to survive in camp until the final day of this camp in April 1945. He was changed and he managed to escape during the rebellion of the prisoners in late April 1945. With a lot of injuries, he managed to return to the home, and after war, he remarried, and his first daughter, Ljubica, was named after the daughter who was killed during the war, killed in the sense that she was tortured and raped, and she was only 11 years old. And I have a lot of, I would say, problems in collecting this testimony, because Ljubica has the personal history trauma about this, and she refused to give me audio and video testimony. I didn't insist. I accepted this, and I have her testimony recorded in form of non-standardized interview. But it is important to state importance in collecting such a testimony, especially on Roma in the context of their I would say unknown history in the context of the victims during the Ustaša independence days of Croatia. And I will finish just before the finish. Institution that I have worked with and the institution that I have the testimony of Roma, Jasenovac Memorial Site, Roma Archive with Karola. We have published 3 of the testimony of the Roma, rethinking the Roma resistance. We have published several testimonies about brave Roma during the war. And I will finish before this. Challenging in collecting the Roma testimony. Last week we have the workshop in Prague, and I asked my colleagues, especially who are now working in the recording testimony, to give me advice in how to focus in collecting the testimony of the Roma, how to overcome the problems with the trauma, especially when we are having the problems in question of sexual violence and others. And this is the open research question that we need to focus. Unfortunately, we don't have first generation direct victims of the mass crimes. We are now, I think, trying to focus on second generation sons, daughters, relatives of the direct Roma victims. And we are now, I think that we are now must have the methodology, new approach of the researching this second generation of witnesses, especially in the context of using these testimonies in the scientific way and and put them under the critical scientific analysis. And I will finish this. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any question, I would like to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
and before the
Absolutely, thank you so much. So the second speaker is going to be Verena Meier, and the title of her presentation in the midst of archive Romani Voices of Nazi Persecution, some epistemological reflections.
Yeah, hello, and thank you for inviting me to this workshop and the wonderful organization. Within archival collections of governmental institutions, such as the civil administration, police records, as well as diverse collections of private people in the archives, testimonials of persecuted Sinti and Roma can be found. In the following presentation, I would like to focus on analyzing these traces of Romani voices in their communicative, social historical context, as well in relation to the archival provenance. I mainly focus on documents that can be found in state archives, so we added this to the title, state archives, and question what needs to be considered when dealing with these Romani voices. In the meta-analysis, it is argued that it's not only sufficient to analyze these documents on a content level only. Looking at these documents within their communicative function, transmission history, and in connection with other documents from these files, other insights can be abstracted away from the content level. I further hope to open up a wide spectrum of documents that reveal Romani voices in state archives. Due to time limitations, I can unfortunately not always go into detail. The following typology of documents will be dealt with. First, letters or documents written in the name of or by Sinti and Roma to public authorities. Then private letters written to family members or friends. Eyewitness interviews and testimonies in investigation procedures and judicial examination of witnesses in the judicial prosecution of Nazi perpetrators. And last but not least, private photos and documents from property rooms, Effektenkammer, or concentration camps. Communication is the shared feature of almost all of these different types of documents. Communication is generally understood as interaction in a social context, in which sender and receiver exchange signals. The Latin root communicare means to share, and it is in the same semantic field as communis, which means community. I therefore argue that the social aspects of the communication that become evident in the sources by Sinti and Roma are crucial for understanding the sources as such. Situating these sources in their social and communicative context reveals a lot more information than research can gain from the content level alone. The premise of my analysis is that communication does not only take place in a linear way only, from sending a message from a sender to a receiver. Communication is rather seen as a reciprocal process in which at least two interlocutors, Gesprächspartner in German, engage in sending and receiving messages and feedback. Communication studies also provides further aspects that can be considered when analyzing communication. The question here is, who says what, in which channel, to whom, with what effect? The message is sent through a channel, such as speaking or writing, and a medium, such as telephone, letter, etc. The receiver is sending feedback through verbal and non-verbal responses. The fields of experiences between sender and receiver overlap in the moment of the interaction, but are mainly distinct. Also, this transactional model of communication acknowledges that the information exchange is influenced by the environment and state of the interlocutors, as well as the social context, such as the interpersonal relation or the situational as well as organizational context that frame the communication. Furthermore, for us as historians, it is important to take the archival context as the black frame and provenance into consideration, as these communications are only available to us as historical sources. In order to reconstruct the entire communication and intertexture and maybe even across media, which means like combining different sources such as oral history and testimony with written documentation, is needed. Let us now return to the different types of documents and the letters or documents written in the name of or by Sinti and Roma to public authorities. Writing letters is as old as the beginning of civilization, and letters from private people to public officials can already be found in ancient civilizations. The examples of such early letters are appeals for release from imprisonment, so-called Freilassungsgesuche. One of the earliest of such letters can be found from Babylonian times. Over the years and with the establishment of the modern state apparatus, the judicial administrations have defined the forms of appeals for release from imprisonment could take. For instance, that in some cases, that it could only be made by a legal consultant. If letters written in the name of or by Sinti and Roma to public authorities are found in state archives, this communication was highly shaped by the organizational context of the addressee's institution. For the period of Nazi persecution and post-war years, I could identify at least 6 types of letters and documents and almost 600 personal files that the Magdeburg criminal police kept for persecuted Sinti and Roma from that region. I cannot go into detail to all of these different types. I will focus on appeals for release from concentration camps, which were specific to the Nazi period, and have separate presentations on Romani voices after 1945, which dealt with the compensation. Interestingly, these types of documents can all be classified as direct speech acts, according to their function. Speech act theory, according to Austin and Searle, who are considered the founding fathers of this approach, asks what speakers do with language. Based on the assumption that language use is not only limited to exchanging information, but also used to perform and exchange and change our surroundings through the speech act. The speaker can change the world's course by a mere utterance, like the President of the United States when he declares the war on terror, or the US war on terror, or the priest when he says, "I hereby declare you husband and wife." John Searle argued that speech acts can be classified into 5 categories depending on the performative verbs. First, assertives that can be judged true or false, like Madrid is the capital of Spain. Second, directives, like the phrase "close the door," which are attempts by the speaker to get the hearer to do something. Third, commissives, with which the speaker commits himself or herself to perform an action. Fourth, expressives, in which the speaker expresses a psychological state about the situation or state of affairs denoted by the proposition. And fifth, declaratives, with which the speaker brings about a change in the world by uttering the sentence. I gave an example before. And declaratives must be tied to an institutional context in order for the speech act to be effective. On the side of the Sinti and Roma, writing letters and documents to public authorities mostly are a combination of directives and commissives, as well as assertives. The declaratives were eventually restricted to the public authorities who were addressed with these writings. Let me now turn to an example to clarify these observations. In the course of the so-called Aktion Arbeitsscheuerei, 3 male Sinti from Quedlinburg, who were between 40 and 50 years old, were transported to the concentration camp Sachsenhausen on the 17th of June 1938 from Magdeburg. Only 3 days after the arrests, one of the wives wrote a letter to the district president, the Regierungspräsident, who was responsible for the administration of the entire Magdeburg district in the Prussian province Saxonia. At the time she sent the letter, her husband was in a transport to the concentration camp already. She writes to the Regierungspräsident that she had been in fear since her husband had been taken away and she had been left alone with 8 children. According to speech act theory, we see here mainly expressives, but also assertives when she refers to her pregnancy and the state of her children. But it's a very emotional letter in which she refers to her psychological and emotional state. In the letter, she goes on and describes the situation of the family in Quedlinburg and the discrimination they face when trying to find an apartment or job. And she also asked the question in German, warum machen Sie mir meinen Mann vor, der war doch ganz anständig? She answered the following missives and directives, pledging they would get an apartment in Leitzkau and her husband would find a workplace. She asked the Regierungspräsident for release and referred to his powers as high as civil servant to do so, and finally praised God. This letter is very expressive in terms of the writer's emotions, but we can also find appeals that are less expressive. Sometimes these appeals say something like, the inmate has learned how to work in the camp. With statements like this, the writer aligns his or her request to the addressee's expectations. This makes using this kind of letters very demanding in educational context, as stereotypical assumptions are perpetuated in letters that entail Romani voices. So when we now connect these letters to the entire files and other documents, we can find out that Maria Steinbach was in fact also writing letters for other wives whose husbands were taken. And the Magdeburg Criminal Police then asked the subordinate Quedlinburg Police to do investigations because they thought these letters must have been written by a third person, because here the stereotypical assumption is implicated that Sinti and Roma are not able to read or write. And they said if it was a third person, then it could be considered a criminal act of providing unauthorized legal advice. So the Quedlinburg police did the investigations and eventually found out that Maria Steinbach, in fact, went to a Catholic school and could read or write, and reported this back. And in total, Maria Steinbach wrote at least 9 letters, which can be reconstructed through the whole file and files of other persecuted and arrested. And she addressed different authorities, like the Regierungspräsident I already mentioned, the Gestapo, the Magdeburg Criminal Police Authorities, the Reichskriminalpolizeiamt, but also Hermann Göring and Adolf Hitler himself. Only 2 of these letters can be found in the files of the criminal police in Magdeburg, but the entire exchange can be reconstructed. On the sides of the addressees, all these letters, no matter whom they were addressed to, they always went a specific way. And according to the General Decree from 14th December 1937 and the following guidelines from April 1938 on the preventive police detention, all these requests for release had to be sent to the Reichskriminalpolizeiamt for decision making. And the Reichskriminalpolizeiamt itself was followed, like after the decree from 1937, a restructuring of the whole organization happened throughout the years, and by 1941 we find this structure. And the red part shows that special officers were in fact in charge for dealing with these kind of letters, and special case officers were dealing with them. And it was divided according to different regions of the Kriminalpolizeileitstellen. And when we question these kind of addressees' behaviors further, we find testimonies also by criminal police officers working for these officers, and they give an insight on their working procedures. And in 1966, Ferdinand Hartling testified, I quote, Entwürfe für Schreibverfügungen zu fertigen und dem zuständigen Vorgesetzten zur Unterschriftleistung vorzulegen, and of course that was his task. So he was making drafts, and they had to be signed by superiors. He also made clear, I quote, Entscheidungsbefugnis hatten nur unsere Vorgesetzten, so only the superiors could make eventually a decision. And we also find in the lower criminal police levels, like Magdeburg, we find these kind of questions about authorships and drafting and rewriting. As here we find an answer to a request for release, which was drafted by a lower ranking police officer, and he added a passage that the director of the criminal police office, Kurt Moritz, did not like to be sent, so he crossed it out, and we find other medium ranking police officers who also added some like minor stylistic corrections. By this time, you might be wondering whether all these letters Maria Steinbach wrote were effective and her husband, or Hulda Laubinger's husband, were released. Anton Steinbach did not get released, so her husband, but August Laubinger, so the letters she was writing in favor of another wife, he did get released on the 25th of August 1939. These examples demonstrate the arbitrariness of the terror apparatus, as both men were in fact in a similar condition. Let me now turn to the second category, private letters written to family members. Here, the context and the interpersonal relation is very different. The two interlocutors are on the same social level, and there was generally not an asymmetric power relation involved. The field of experience, as well as the situational, interpersonal, and organizational context, etc., again shape the communication process. This is, for instance, seen in letters that were written in a prison or a so-called Zuchthaus. In the criminal records for Kurt Laubinger, Laubinger, who was sentenced to 5 years Zuchthaus in Coesbeek in 1936 because of attempted manslaughter, we find letters to his wife and from his friends. Together with other documents in this file, it becomes clear that this exchange of letters was highly regulated by the prison authorities. Only the first letters to his wife is left in the file, and one letter by Sinti friends from Heine, as well as several letters from his wife to the prison and Zuchthaus authorities, asking for permission to visit. A note in the file that Kurt Laubinger could not write raises the question of authorship again. Unlike the records from the criminal police, these files do not give a hint on the context of writing. On the content level, Kurt Laubinger tells his wife that he is still in Magdeburg, in the police prison, and does not yet know when he would be transferred to the Zuchthaus in Coesbeek. He also announced that he would be able to send and receive letters every 6 weeks. He requested her to send descriptions of what she is doing and asked her to stay on his side. The time would go by and they would start a new life together. They were still young enough. In the prison, he was surrounded by good people, among them an owner of a restaurant in Oldenstedt. He would be released in 6 weeks and then meet Kurt Laubinger's wife to tell her more about his situation in the prison. Furthermore, he inquires about the other family members' situation. After he signed his letter, he included a poem that starts with the following phrase and continues in a similar way. I quote, "Wenn du einmal traurig bist, dann denk an unsere schönen Stunden," end of quote. As there was still space on the backside of the DNA5 paper, he included a request that she should send her answers immediately. And we find similar documents in non-state archives. This is from the Documentation and Cultural Center in Heidelberg, a letter that was smuggled out of Auschwitz and contained a coded reference to the atrocities in Romani. Coming to the third category, we already heard in the first presentation a bit about that, about the different types of Romani voices when we deal with witnesses or testimonies. And here, sorry, it's cut off. We have to differentiate between two different kinds of testimonies and witnesses. One's the juridical witness and testimony in the traditional sense, when someone is questioned by the authorities like the police or the judicial authorities regarding to a criminal charge, and this is highly regulated in the German context by the Code of Criminal Procedure, which was first drafted or published in 1877. And this has to be differentiated from the testimonies, which can be called Holocaust eyewitnesses or survivor testimonies from after 1945. As here we have a different concept or notion of testimony, and they can be, in fact, as has been argued, defined as speech acts and communal knowledge generation. And we also heard it in the presentation before, it's not only about providing facts and discursive testimony, but it's also about the embodied testimony. And that a lot more is in the testimony than on the content and information level. So one important example during the Eichmann trial, Setnik painted when giving his testimony, and that opened up the whole discussion of like conceptualizing witness testimonies, survivor testimonies anew. And here you see the different structures of such hearings by the police or judicial authorities. Always the personal data had to be given first, then they were questioned about the criminal charge, then a cautioning happened, then a hearing about the criminal charge, and then the recording, either audio recording or the transcript was read and had to be signed. And here we find in the field of legal studies and discourse by practitioners discussion about how these hearings should be recorded, whether they should be verbatim, so word by word, or in officialese, Amtsdeutsch, and put in a chronological and coherent narrative. And this was of high legal relevance because if you change the authentic voices through your transcript, then the legal argument can become less authentic, basically, for the defendant. And in these documents, we find also questions and accusations that were done by the authorities. Now let me, for finishing, turn to a very interesting and surprising find in the Federal Archives, which is private photos and documents from property rooms. And in Vienna, categorized them as prisoners and personnel of detention centers and concentration camps. And then we asked the archivist, because it was quite surprising to find these, if she can tell me more about this fund. And she said it's a holding stock for personal documents of unknown origin or of such provenance for which the Federal Archives have not yet formed their own stocks. This entire collection has been processed by the archivists, and I indexed the names, but they are not themselves sure about this provenance. And here we find also other letters written to an inmate of the Zuchthaus Großweg. It's not the one we saw before, it's another one, who was incarcerated for the same kind of accusations, the same fight that they got into. And here we find, for example, a birthday card, or also private letters written by his family members, which again include a lot of expressives, assertives, and commissives. And here we also find, for example, the information that they all, like the whole family, is trying to work really hard and gain a lot of money to get a legal representative for like helping them in this situation. In other files of this collection, we also find private photos. And also like certificates that the inmate had been working for a company. It's my hypothesis is that these come from the concentration camp Buchenwald, because we find references to the transfer to Buchenwald inside some of these documents. And this is Heidelberg, so I showed you the birthday cards before, and in the Arolsen archives we actually find the documents from the list from the Effektenkammer, where properties were taken from him, and here we also find the info for letters, and it's exactly the same number of letters I found in Bundesarchiv. So like the different aspects we can look at when dealing with these sources from state archives is, first of all, there's not just the content level, but also the communicative and social context and the whole organizational, relational context and power relations, etc., that shape the communication. That communication is in fact processual and transactional, that we have to analyze it in a wider context. The questions of censorship and self-censorship arise, as well as authorship and what we saw from the perpetrator's decision-making, authority and signing. Then the verbatim and officialese transcripts, whether it's a word-for-word record or like a synthesis and summary. And then the different concepts of witnesses and testimonies that appear when we deal with judicial prosecution, and testimonies given by survivors, as well as when we have, for example, testimonies in non-state archives like the Fortunoff archives, which have all the different notions or concepts on different witness and testimonies. Then we can also question the role of archives in indexing these documents to make them accessible for research. And finally, we can think about speech acts and what is actually done with the words in these testimonies and Romani voices. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, so our last speaker at this panel is going to be Simina, who is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge, and the title of her talk is going to be The Politics, Dilemmas, and Paradoxes of Working with Roma Holocaust Testimonies from Publicly Available Sources.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Hi, everybody. As Angela said, my name is Verena. I'm a second-year PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. But before I begin, I would like to thank especially Maria for all the help she gave me and for the organizers for having me here. And I would like to clarify that I am aware that the term Roma Holocaust is not a consensus, and I am very happy to justify my choice in the Q&A. This is just the choice I made when writing the dissertation upon which this presentation is based, so I wanted to stay truthful to that. Okay. Given that I'm going to talk about very intimate experiences that have been made very public, it is only fair to situate myself in my encounter with the testimonies before I outline my main arguments. I do this because I hold a deep political belief that the often invoked neutrality, objectivity, and impenetrability of academics and researchers is nothing more than a myth, and a colonial myth at that. So here we go. I wrote this dissertation upon which this presentation is based between May and August 2020, when I was a master's student at the University of Cambridge. You might recall that the summer of 2020 was, in many places, a time of lockdowns, states of exception, death and panic due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also a time of racial reckoning, of rightful upheaval against the many centuries of institutionalized racism, a time of intense political hope and despair. On a personal level, I was a somewhat homeless master's student, running out of money to keep me living in Cambridge and out of time to write this dissertation. Thinking with Marginals then, the events mentioned in the testimonies, the recording of the testimonies, my reading and writing about the testimonies in the moment of the global pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as writing these reflections 2 years later, all share, quote, a single spatial and temporal moment, despite being different, perhaps even opposing, layers of collective and individual memory. My encounter with these testimonies was emotional, as well as it was analytical, and it was entangled in larger webs of politics and affect. I'm also telling you this because I want to highlight that what are now arguments in a presentation were then really gut feelings, decisions made under pressure, and things I learned on the job, as it were. I was not trained as a historian, and I continue not to be a historian. I'm not a historian. However, the experience of writing this dissertation and encountering the testimonies completely changed me and my academic orientation. I never stopped thinking about the dilemmas I faced and the gut feelings I had during this process. Hence why I'm here today, and I'm very honored to be able to share my reflections with you. And I will be as honest as I can, and these are just reflections. Again, I'm not a historian. Okay, so here we go. My master's dissertation explored the necropolitical effects of the representations and knowledge about Romani people which circulated in the Romanian state apparatus and among cultural and academic elites during the interwar period. I argued that knowledge and representations have power, their speech acts, as we just heard, and that there is a link between the Roma Holocaust and the broader white Romanian elite, beyond just the Antonescu government. I decided to include a chapter spotlighting the testimonies of survivors and the realities created by the Antonescu regime. I will say more later on about why. The dilemmas related to the use of the testimonies emerged partly due to the paradoxical nature of representing human experience, but mostly because the testimonies I had access to in the pandemic were publicly available through the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. Another factor which weighed heavily on my mind was my positionality as a white Romanian, but also the positionality of the institution from which and for which I was writing, the University of Cambridge. Although this is not a fact that Cambridge advertised, some of the most prominent eugenicists were trained at Cambridge, such as Francis Galton or Ronald Fisher. Not a day went by without me reflecting on this. As a result of these concerns, my dilemmas were the following. My dilemmas reflect the professional socialization into the colonial research art that I gained at Cambridge, where researching means looking for, then finding, observing, interpreting, and finally representing and disseminating. That does not mean that other ways of working with testimonies or of knowing the testimonies, indeed embodied ways, for example, are not possible. Thus, I do not aim for my conclusions here to be anything but my conclusions, far from anything prescriptive or normative. So, dilemma one. In the earlier described colonial research art, interpretation predates representation. Writing about working with archives of extreme violence, Jelena Subotic argues that interpretation is a matter of ethics. I definitely agree with her. Throughout the research, I asked myself what it means for me as a white Romanian to witness these testimonies with an academic hat on. To be an academic means to interpret. To interpret means to alter. Given the violence justified through racist representations of Roma communities throughout time, as documented, for example, by Magda Matake or Mihai Surdu, I asked myself whether the act of writing about such trauma in an academic form by me, flesh of the perpetrators, is not in fact an act of violence in itself. Susan Sontag, for example, argues against interpretation. She characterizes interpretation as a modern way of understanding something through certain rules. Quote, by interpretation, I mean here a conscious act of the mind which illustrates a certain code, certain rules of interpretation, blocking a set of elements from the whole work. The task of interpretation is virtually one of translation. Interpretation in our own time is an overt contempt for appearances. Some things are better felt than interpreted, she suggests. On the other hand, trying to convince myself that I, or indeed anyone, could interact with any text or discourse on the basis of mere witnessing as opposed to interpretation seemed like trying to lie to myself. Knowledge is always already socially situated, meaning that our perspective of reality is already imperfect. Witnessing without interpretation is thus not possible. So if interpretation is inevitable, that means that we need to make choices about how to interpret, not whether to interpret in the first place. What I mean by this is that we need to make ourselves aware of the rules of interpretation Sontag refers to, and actively and consciously decide upon the frameworks from whose standpoint we interpret. I understood the idea of framing of interpretation as the theoretical devices I used in conversation with the testimonies, as well as the context in which I use the testimonies. In my work, the testimonies act as political starting points and political imperative to guide the work. What I mean by that is that I interpreted and represented the realities outlined in the testimonies in order to show two things. Firstly, that the dominant historical and political narratives which deny or distort the violence of the deportations to Transnistria are fundamentally false and undermine the pursuit of reparations and justice for this violence, as evidenced by the recent publication by Magda Matake and colleagues. Relatedly, that the Romanian state engaged in a genocide of Roma communities during the Second World War. In practice, I use Achille Mbembe's theory of necropolitics, particularly the concepts of death worlds and living dead, to illustrate that the Romanian state essentially created an environment in Transnistria where death was inevitable. I started my analysis with the testimonies, outlining the cruelty of the death worlds and the experiences of the living dead, and I then moved to government discourses and academic knowledge production in the early 20th century up until the deportations to Transnistria. I did this in order to show the effects of the politics of knowledge production and representations, hence the title of my dissertation, but also to show that anti-Roma racism did not start nor die with Antonescu. Yeah, I guess that's not controversial. Thus, this was the framework from which I chose to bear witness to the testimonies I had access to. That does not mean that the decisions about how to write this up and how to represent the testimonies to the world was an easy one, which brings me to my next dilemma. How can we represent the trauma of survivors ethically? The public nature of the testimony stood out for me when I was thinking about the politics of representation. On the one hand, I had some practical concerns that nonetheless seemed to me to have significant political implications. As I'm sure everyone here is aware, it is totally possible to find the primary footage and transcriptions of survivors' testimonies online. Initially, this seemed great because I was locked down in England and I had to write a dissertation, and I had no other way to access them. However, the situation became much more complicated once I watched the videos and read the transcripts. My immediate question became, how was consent obtained? The US Holocaust Memorial Museum does not provide any details on the consent processes undergone before recording the testimonies, at least not to my knowledge. Alongside consent, I was worried about the ways the interviewers approached the survivors. There were many instances when the survivors were crying or were clearly uncomfortable. I thought some interviewers mishandled those situations, forcing the survivors to open up and provide details when it was clear to me, watching the footage, that the interviewer should have stopped and respected the silences of trauma. This felt to me extractive and exploitative. Not only that, but this was up on the internet for anybody to see, with the names and locations of survivors spelled out. Against this backdrop, I had to make choices. The first practical choice I made was to anonymize the testimonies and to not use any video or photographic material. This was because I had a feeling that the survivors were not appropriately informed that their intimate memories would be put out there for the world to see and for researchers to interpret. Moreover, the use of video or photographic material felt exoticizing to me, as if I was saying to my readers, look, this is what a survivor looks like, turning survivors into objects defined by difference. Yet this was not an easy decision at all. The anonymization and lack of clear representation of who the survivors were, felt like it could also be an erasure of identity, potentially further dehumanizing and depersonalizing the survivors. Rebecca Einborner explains this feeling by pointing out that anonymizing the survivors' testimonies could be seen as a reproduction of the very practices of the Nazis. I felt that anonymizing would be most respectful to the stories of the survivors, but I'm still not entirely sure whether I've made the right choice. The second practical choice that I made was to paraphrase graphic and intimate details, meaning I did not use any direct quotations that describe too intimate or graphic circumstances in the writing. This was partly because I felt that this information had sometimes been excavated through the interviewer's pressure upon the participants. In addition to that, I agree with Subotic's assertion that not all text is usable text, and not all text is for the researcher's gaze. I would add that not all text should be made public and reshared with research readers. On the other hand, but also intimately connected to these somewhat practical decisions, I was constantly thinking about how to not turn my writing, and thus my representation of the testimonies, into a spectacle of suffering, where pain is exposed for the sake of exposing it, or worse, for some kind of morbid entertainment. I understand that sometimes writers and curators choose to highlight suffering in detail in the hope that this would awaken a political instinct and unify people in political actions against violence and its perpetrators. Regarding this, Susan Sontag writes, for a long time, some people believed that if the horror could be made vivid enough, most people would finally take in the outrageousness, the insanity of war. This, I think, is applicable to how some view testimonies of extreme violence. Certainly, my supervisor did, and actually my supervisor pressured me into going into a quick description. We can add to Zoltak's assertion the outrageousness, insanity, and inhumanity of genocide and racially motivated murder. George Floyd and Stanislav Tamas were murdered over and over again in front of our very eyes, and it did move some of us for a while, but the outpour of anti-racist initiatives and solidarity statements ultimately did nothing to shift the structures which led to genocide and racially motivated murder. We witnessed, but we were not transformed. Indeed, I agree with Sontag's assertion that no we, as in audience looking at the pain, should be taken for granted when the subject is looking at other people's pain. The people who read, interpret, represent, disseminate the politically available testimonies are not a uniform mass who are committed to anti-fascism and anti-racism. And frankly, neither are the subjects who read and use our research. This is why anonymization of the testimonies and the avoidance of very intimate details or photo video representation was so important to me. I could not assume a we that would receive the testimonies in good faith. Additionally, Hannah Arendt, for example, would certainly disagree with the idea that the exposure of intense suffering would lead to political action against violence. For Arendt, platforming suffering in politics, the politics of pity, as she calls it, perpetuates a world in which suffering is glorified, a world which cannot exist without suffering. Basing politics on the universality of suffering, she argues, reduces all people to one, and thus undermines plurality, the uniqueness of human beings, which for Arendt is the precondition of anti-totalitarian politics. Thinking with Arendt, but also with Toni Morrison, suffering is turned into a spectacle under the white gaze, which anonymizes suffering, universalizes it, and thus avoids responsibility. Focusing on the act of suffering allows us to avoid thinking about the cause of suffering and how we may be entangled and implicated, to use Michael Rothberg's term, into the structures that led to that suffering. Thinking universally, it could have been anyone, for example, allows us to avoid the reality that the genocide was based precisely on a biopolitical project of purifying the nation. So no, it could not have been anyone. Moreover, engaging in this kind of universalist politics of pity can, in my opinion, become dehumanizing. In focusing too much on the nature of the suffering, there is a risk that we flatten and ignore survivors' whole existence and uniqueness as humans, reducing them to an essential category of pain and suffering. It dawned on me that turning the act of surviving into an identity category creates an economy of authenticity and depoliticizes the act of surviving itself by centering pity. Creating an economy of authenticity of surviving is very dangerous in my view. Writing on the colonial, I have 5 minutes, okay, I'll keep going. Writing on the colonial nature of social science research, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith draws our attention to the fact that the very notion of authenticity implies essentialism and objectification. Thinking with Linda Smith and Ari Yoshkovitz, I would then argue that instead of seeing survivors' testimonies as political knowledge, we become concerned with establishing who the real survivor or the model victim is, and whether they suffered enough to truly be called a victim of the Holocaust. As Ari Yoshkovitz points out, this has very real material effects upon the research that becomes possible, but also upon the lives of survivors after the act of surviving. To clarify and conclude this bit of my argument, I'm not saying that we shouldn't use Roma testimonies, nor am I giving any sort of prescription for how and when to use them. Indeed, Foucault argued that the real genealogy, that is the challenging of the power-knowledge nexus, a nexus that led to the Holocaust itself in many ways, cannot be achieved without bringing to light subjugated knowledges, which challenge dominant and widely accepted narratives about what really happened, who the real victims were, who the real perpetrators were, and how justice is to be achieved. Instead, I'm trying to raise questions about how, why, and in what context we use such knowledge born out of struggles, to cite Foucault. As I said in the introduction, and I can only do this from my perspective, which brings me to the final part of my argument, the dilemma about what my responsibility is as a white Romanian. Historical and political responsibility in research comes, in my opinion, from how we as individuals and as institutions are situated in the world. By this I mean the context, structures, and institutions that give me power. I find Michael Rothberg's concept of implication useful for thinking about my historical responsibility. Rothberg argues, I quote, implicated subjects occupy positions aligned with power and privilege without being themselves direct agents of harm. They contribute to, inhabit, inherit, or benefit from regimes of domination, but do not originate or control such regimes. End of quote. As such, it doesn't matter that I am not Ioan Antonescu himself. What matters is that I profit from the workings of white supremacy in the Romanian context and globally, and that I need to think of ways to tackle that. This is, of course, easier said than done. A potentially useful place to start thinking about this is acknowledging that we are situated beings and have no way of escaping either social inequality nor power. As academics in particular, it is our duty to think about how we came to be seen as neutral, objective, and authoritative. To me, that means acknowledging the colonial project underpinning social sciences, as well as the colonial entanglements of the institution from which I speak. On a more concrete level, I came up with two principles that help me guide my thinking around the questions of historical responsibility. Firstly, I will argue that it's important to not turn suffering into a spectacle through the white gaze. As Sontag reminds us, the interpreter, without actually erasing or rewriting the text, is altering the text. If interpretation is not a neutral endeavor, it's a matter of responsibility to be careful about which meanings, frameworks, and lenses we bring into the process of interpretation, especially how our position in society influences our thinking. Secondly, and relatedly, I think we, or at least I, have the responsibility to think contextually and to not universalize suffering as a mere inevitable trait of the human condition. I found Julia Gatta's argument about suffering as a situation helpful in this regard. Gatta draws on Karl Jasper's conceptualization of individuality and individual experiences in relation to place, time, and people that surround it, i.e. as situated. In this way, what happens to our fellow humans affects us as well, given that human subjectivity is relational. Conceptualizing suffering as a situation calls on us to recognize why and in what context that suffering happened to that specific person or that specific group of people. Meaning to see the racist motivations of the deportations to Transnistria and the genocidal nature of the state action. It seems to me that conceptualizing suffering as a situation also calls upon us to not only bear witness or engage in politics of pity, but to recognize those who suffer in their full humanity and complexity and take responsibility for our implication in their suffering. Ultimately, thinking with Sontag, Arendt, and Jaspers, I would argue that when we present representation of violence on their own, we decontextualize the histories of both victims and perpetrators, as well as the histories of their encounters. To me, it is thus important to acknowledge the long history of anti-Roma racism and violence alongside the testimonies of survivors of the deportations to Transnistria, to not fall into the trap of exceptionalism. In this way, we can recognize that anti-Roma racism in Romania did not start nor end with the Antonescu regime, and that the genocide of Roma is entangled in the world history of colonial violence and white supremacy.
Thank you.
Just one more.
Don't worry, this is fine. This is perfect.
Go ahead.
No, this is
No,
perfect.
go ahead.
I just wanted to say essentially that I'm hoping for anti-colonial politics which recognize the interrelations between genocides everywhere, here and in other spaces. I mean, thank you.
Thank you so much. So we still have actually approximately 30 minutes for a discussion. So it was really heavy Monday morning. Sorry for being such a slow chair, but I think it was really incredible, all the presentations, what we had. Like Danijel, you really tried to investigate the context of their credibility, right? The testimony, that how can we use the testimonies and how can we reconstruct. And Verena, you gave a really like a rich, arsenal of documents, what you were using, letters written in the name of or by Sinti, Roma, all kinds of private letters, which has been used from this archive, and use eyewitnesses interviews and testimonies in investigation procedures, memories, and private photos. And this postcard, what you show, it was really, really incredible to see. And I really liked the articulation what you made. Like there's not just discursive testimony, what we have to take into account, but also an embodied testimony, which has not stunted by mainstream historiography. Can I say that? I'm not a historian. And Simina, you just turned the table, absolutely, and you connected the Roma Holocaust, and you gave a really good justification why you are using that. You made a connection with the anti-colonial struggles and colonialism, and you wanted to point out actually that we have to see the suffering as a condition and not as a situation which can be seen as a universal, right? Anyway, so I think it was very, very rich and very interesting. And as you figured out that, like, as our first panel has been called like the method and ethics of knowing, so it really raised several ethical questions, methodological as well as epistemological. And I would like to underline the epistemological part because that somehow is always under theorized or under discussed, and I really like that we start to interrogate the inequality, the epistemology of inequalities, like we can use as a testimonial inequalities, which is turned out, right, when the hearer doesn't want to believe that what happened, and creating another story, or hermeneutical, which is like a more structural. We do not have a words, we do not have a discourse, we do not have a theory to describe and interpret such a things. And also, Simina, you just put it on the table squarely that even interpretation, it's very much questionable and always altering and changing the substance of the testimony. So I will stop here, and I really would like to invite you to make a comments, questions, and some notes. Nidhi.
Hello, yes. Danijel, thank you so much. It was really interesting to take a deeper dive into the Croatian archives. One person whose book, has been around for many years, this is Dragos. You didn't mention it in your presentation. I was just wondering, you're a historian, correct?
Yes.
Yes. As a historian, you must have studied Ackovic's book, obviously, on Jasenovac.
Yes.
And how would you put that in the context of your own research, your own study, and what is your interpretation of that book? That's just one side question. And should I go with? I have three other questions for the. Okay, thank you. And by the way, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to see everybody here after so many years, after COVID. I mean, the scholars here, and it's a great pleasure to be in Vienna again after all these years. So Verena, thank you so much. And as a young woman in her 20s, visiting Europe, in Germany, I had visited Sachsenhausen. And this was, I don't even remember what year, I'll have to dig in my diary, but I remember it was in the 90s, the early 90s. And at that time, I think Sachsenhausen, the camp itself, had not been very developed, had not, what's happened. I don't want to call it the Disneyfication. I don't want to call it that, but certainly the kind of eerie atmosphere and the kind of effect and impact it had on your body as a human when you were visiting the camps earlier, before the changes, like the cosmetic changes and the refurbishment or whatever of the camps. It was very different back then. Anyway, so Maria Steinberg, what an incredible source. What an incredible source. I mean, I would love to see a scholar like you or a group of scholars writing a book about Maria Steinberg's voice and what does that mean for historiography of the Holocaust at that time. And you said something very powerful, the arbitrariness of the terror apparatus. That really struck with me. Indeed, the arbitrariness of the terror apparatus. So the terror apparatus that Maria Steinberg, through her letters, through her, many, many letters. Oh my goodness. When you were talking, I was just getting, goosebumps. Sorry. So yeah, if you can share with me that from Maria Steinberg's collection of letters, has that added to the historiography overall of the Holocaust, of the Roma Holocaust, and Roma Holocaust? And then finally, just a quick question, the Romani coded language, the letters that were written partly in the coded Romanes, how did you work with the scholars and the linguists? Did you consult with local Romani, native speakers to decode that, that kind of thing? And thank you so much, Simona. This is the first time I'm seeing you speak, and I would love to talk to you during the coffee. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's my first appearance.
Can we collect some other questions and comments? And maybe if you would introduce yourself at the very beginning, that would be very useful.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lauralie French, and I'll speak later with Verena on Chaya Stoica. And this was a wonderful panel. My question is mostly also for Verena in terms of putting speech acts, and maybe we can talk about it after we have actually talked, but I'm wondering how you would fit Chaya Stoica's, we'll talk about her notebooks, her art, how you would fit those into, kind of historical documents, speech acts. And I also wanted a little clarification. You talked about transcribing these official documents, and I didn't quite catch, the pros and cons of doing it, authentically, so to speak, as opposed to trying to correct them or something. So if you could just expand on that, that would be great.
Okay. So shall we start?
Okay, to answer, David Batswich, my good colleague, but I will say friend. I'm now just editing his paper from the conference in Zagreb in April about Svetozar's image and his experience during the Second World War imprisonment and so on. When I started with the research 19 years ago, Dragos Batswich was among the first that helped, that are in Yugoslavia. I will not say he is not historian, but he is dealt much more history than as anthropologic and philosophy as he is. He didn't publish just Jasenovac. He published one important book, Bili su samo žrtve. There were only victims, if I can direct translate it. And in Jasenovac, and especially in that book, Bili su samo žrtve, there were only victims. He published this kind of sources from State Commission and Public Prosecutor Office. And it is important that this was done in 1990s and early the beginning of the 21st century. And this was the first book that, the first correct, I would say, starting point for my research when I was finished my faculty in 2003 and started to work with this. We have also Rajko Đurić in Serbia, also not historian, unfortunately. In Croatian, Yugoslav, ex-Yugoslav, we didn't have any professional historians that have dealt systematically with the topic of persecution of Roma, especially in the context of collecting and, I was emphasizing, analyzing the memories. I would also have opportunity to ask my colleague the question, as I, as a historian, have a lot of problem in not just collecting, but interpreting the testimony, especially in this such of term, but we can discuss later, in such term, white, privileged and non-Roma researcher and so on. We can open discussion on this.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for the many questions. So, first of all, the biggest question whether these Romani voices, especially Maria Steinberg, has added to the historiography of the Holocaust in general. Not yet, because the specific documents that I'm analyzing for my dissertation, it's 600 files by the criminal police on individual persecuted And one civil rights activist looked at them systematically in the GDR in East Germany in order to help survivors in compensation matters. And he published first works on the persecution of Sinti and Roma in Magdeburg and the region of the GDR. But these sources have not been published or dealt with. So they will be a huge contribution, and maybe Carola can also say more about the Rom archive and Voices of the Victims, because that is a larger project which takes this approach to do this kind of contribution. But my aim is to contextualize them, because my dissertation's focus is actually the perpetrator history. Because I realized that from the files that I'm dealing with, I need to analyze the perpetrator's work and structures, because that's the main info, because of my positionality and because of the specific kinds of sources. I didn't want to write from their perspective about Sinti and Roma, but I wanted to write about the perpetrators. But this will be a very important contribution in my dissertation, because it's perpetrator history, and I think it's very important to show that it's not only victims, but that there was, and we talked about agency, and that there was the strong agency. But I think also it's important to contextualize this in the whole context of in the society back then, because this really huge collection of archival material gives so much information, and it's a really rich source. Then about the Latin from Auschwitz and Birkenau, it was smuggled and that had codes in Romanes. The documentation and culture center of German Sinti and Roma, they are Sinti as well as Roma who speak Romanes, and they helped with translating it, and it was used in exhibition that I also worked with in creating this exhibition. Then the question, I had to rush a bit through the testimonies and witnesses because I also wanted to get to the last important finding of the Effektenkammer and property rooms. So my argument there was that we deal with two, because sometimes we say testimonies, but from which perspective are we looking at the testimonies? Are we looking at historians? Then we deal with this new concept of testimonies as it has developed since 1945. But if you ask a lawyer, he or she has a totally different notion of same to sources. A source in a legal context is they don't, for example, like private diaries that you talked about. It's a hard legal source. Usually, they wouldn't acknowledge it because in a legal context, it has to have an institutional guarantee that the source is authentic. And if it's a source that is found on the basement or somewhere else, then it would not be perceived as a reliable source in defending the case, basically, or like in arguing for this case. And about the transcripts, so from trials, we usually have the verbatim forms when you find the question and the exact answer to the questions. But in the investigation to the trials, you find the synthesis, the summary. And it's usually, you can imagine, either like a police officer or a judicial prosecutor, consultant, questioning the witnesses. And then they write a synthesis, a summary of it. And then inside the field of legal studies, but also philosophy, the question is whether like a summary in someone else's words, because like if there's question and the witness, because of trauma or like just the day and not drinking maybe enough, is a bit confused or so, and the historical order is not correct. And if the person who poses the questions and writes the transcript, if this person doesn't stick to the order of the narrative, then it's a matter of interpretation again. And then it's not the verbatim, the word for word answers, but it's another layer that is added to it. And then in when it comes to a criminal charge in a trial, the defendant can argue, well, I can see this witness here speaking. This witness does not speak so eloquently as you put it in the transcript of the investigation. So I question this, and for example, if there's contradictions then with the transcript of the investigation and the trial, then this whole, like, in a legal sense, this whole argument can break down just because of the way the transcript was made, because there's contradictions. So that's why I was arguing that maybe there's also it's called déformation professionnelle, like that there's different perspectives from like the legal field on witnesses and on like for historians, for example, and that we have to bear this in mind when we as historians deal with these kind of sources, because we have to understand the context these were made and then also the legal discourses around them. And about Stoica, just briefly, because you talked about different like paintings or diary entries, and what I also was a bit short of saying, speech act you mentioned earlier, that speech acts are also about whether the hearer acknowledges what's being said. So that's really important, and I think we especially with Stoica and her, like, one can say almost global presence of her works, I think she manages, or her legacy manages, that this voice is being heard, that the speech act is effective in a way. And then it's also a question of paintings, because like putting something into a visual form is maybe just another way of finding a way of communicating something that you cannot put into words. And then we are with the same notions of like speechlessness and embodied memory. Yeah.
Simina, would you like to contribute to this discussion?
Yeah, I think this question of the legal understanding of testimony is really relevant, because it shows us this kind of like enlightenment binary, right, between mind and body. But if we're honest to ourselves, you think differently when your body is having a bad day, for example, right? Like this binary is artificial. But then to me, you know, the legal system is the system of the state. And if the state is the nation state itself as a political project is that which creates the violence, then how can I rely on the legal system? You know, I mean, it's a paradox. It doesn't make any sense, but this is the kind of Westphalian world that we live in. And it doesn't make any sense. But then for me, that's the question of interpretation, not so much. I really don't want to turn it into a question of identity. It's, for me, it's more an epistemological question, like you were saying, Angela, because it's about, am I able as the receiver or the thinker, the academic, to recognize that there's knowledge beyond this idea of a truth, you know? Like you see, in at least in the historiography related to Romania, discussions on numbers or who were the bigger number of victims. To me, I mean, maybe this is controversial. To me, it doesn't really matter, you know? It's a lost human life. And that's like the violence happening is the murdered person on racial grounds. And of course, it's important to contextualize and get the right historical facts. But politically, the life has been lost, you know, and the community has been broken up in important ways. So, yeah, I think we just need to be a little bit more open about our notions of truth, our notions of knowledge, and our notions of rightful survivors. Yeah, I guess that's fine.
Great. Thanks.
Look,
Yes.
Well, after the Simina's presentation, I was a little bit confused. To be sincere, I was a little bit confused. As a historian, as we talked with Anna yesterday, what about the testimonies that are in the diaries, in personal? How can, as a historian, we can interpret? Is this subjective, objective? Can we all be, as a historian, objective in postmodernistic terms? No. As we listen from Simona, we have a lot of questions but not answers. Unfortunately, she put the problems in conceptualizing, interpreting, and at the end, I don't know. I have a lot of questions now. What about? What about? I have found a lot of testimonies. I would say Roma voices, Roma narrative during the war, in the system of the Ustasha perpetrator system, can be interpreted as the Roma victim voices because they need to be under the pressure, self-censorship, and so on. Also, I have asked myself the question as a researcher. Simina said or proposed that the victims of the testimony or author of this testimony can be anonymous without names and surnames. But as a historian, the names are very important. The context without names. And also the question of giving the voices of the victims. Without their names, they are still anonymous voices.
Yeah.
And this is, for me, contradictory and very problematic.
Yeah.
To listen. I would say, and then I will end to give the colleagues the floor. It raises many questions, but my main problem is just to have systematically collecting testimonies, to be not the only one in Croatia that systematically deals with this topic, with this reason. I needed a team to collect the testimony 8 years after the war. We are still not finishing with this process. We are not just, I would say, in the middle of the process. We are in the first quarter, I would say. Then we can talk when, I would say, a lot of this testimony will be collected. Then in Croatian history, we can talk about interpreting and other this kind of problems,
Can I say something to you?
Sure, and after Ari.
No, thanks to Ari. So this is wonderful, and I just perhaps to bring out the tension I see a bit. I mean, I thought there were interesting tensions in presentations, and I think it's productive to bring them out. Which is, I think Simina emphasized representation. The question, but all these challenges that come with presentation, either from issues of positionality or from issues associated with Arendt, Sonntag, of violence and what it does to the system that we represent violence in particular ways. And then there are the other two on the panel were dealing with collecting, I feel. So how do we bring together these two systems? And it's probably good to just be explicit about it because they are connected first, it's easy, yes, from Simina mentioned, it's the Holocaust Museum that makes it available, that allows you to have these reflections, so the collecting precedes it, but the other way around too, the Holocaust Museum only collected these because it was a museum first, it was an educational institution first to get the funding to collect. Without representation, there's no collecting that gets funded. So they are connected, yet they don't need to talk to each other. Basically, collecting can say, well, I'm not there's no sensationalism here. I'm putting things into a nice archive, a database, make it web available, but it remains boring. Don't worry. It's nicely cataloged. And then there's the question of the people who want to use it, who have other ethical dilemmas. But so I think it might be productive to remember that that both sides can say, well, especially the collecting side can say very legitimately, we're not implicated in the representation part. And I wonder, so I guess it ends up a question, so taking Simina's challenge and taking it to the two who are collecting. To what degree is this a challenge for you? And I know you can say, well, we're not in the interpretation business to some degree, or in that type of interpretation, or I'm not sensationalizing violence, and I'm sure you can retreat to some degree, but where does the implication start would be my question, not where does it end?
So I can reconcile two very tensions.
Should I start?
Yes, and after that, what you just telling me, coffee break.
I think that's the right way of putting it, right? I to be honest, I would not. I just don't think I'm personally the kind of person who would go to a survivor and be like, "Tell me your story," because in another context, I know what it means to be a survivor, something else, you know. And it's not something that I would want anybody to have to go through, because it's a painful process and it has to be done, I think, in a specific environment. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it can't be done in a way that's like, I'm putting a camera in front of you, so tell me now about what it was like to live in Transnistria when you were 7. Like, it has to be. I think that the question of what it means to go through trauma needs to predate the point of collection. If we're speaking about people who are still alive, you know, like, you need to think, okay, this is probably the most horrible thing that can happen to a human being. How can I create an environment in which that human being who's gone through this and who I see as a survivor can feel cared for? Essentially, it's a question of care for me. And then it's also a matter of trust. I mean, the other thing is, if I went to my university and said, I have these interviews with whoever, with my family members, and I'm going to put them on YouTube under your ethical guidelines, they would kill me, because that would be illegal, you know? And to me, the question was, are you doing this in such an unethical way because they're Roma? Because you think it's acceptable because they're Roma, you know? Like, that was the question for me. It was like, consent is an institutional process that you have to go through. Otherwise, the university can be sued. And that's something that universities think about. But it didn't, I mean, you put in front of me a testimony as the museum, as the collection, that I don't even know how you obtain consent for this. What is the legal, you know, context in which we're operating? This is somebody's data, you know, but it's not treated as data because it's seen as a public narrative, like they owe it to the public, you know. And that's maybe something I could have touched upon a little bit more. In terms of anonymization, I only did that because of the question of consent, and because I felt, I don't know, I just felt like it wasn't ethical for me in how I was trained and in my kind of sociological background to put somebody's identity forward to the world. I mean, it's not the world. There was 2 examiners, right? It's a master's dissertation. At the end of the day, it's going to, you know, probably be in a drawer forever. But it still was like, but I'm still not sure whether it was the right choice, you know? I still have the question, but I just live with it, I guess.
Again, you open a lot of questions, a lot of problems, but great solutions.
But Danijel, sometimes it's really good to
Yes,
to
it's
have
good. This is positive.
when we are
Look, I think that this is positive.
Yeah.
I think that this
But
is
that
positive.
can be very productive as Eric told, that, you know, we have all these contentious issues and contradictions as well, and paradoxes, but we have to live with that and somehow work with that. And I think the best thing is to discuss it. So why don't we have a coffee break? Thank you so much.